So do you want to buy a house in a flood zone? Well, I'm going to give you my personal experiences because I live in one coming up next. Hey, what's going on everybody? It's Dzienis with eXp Realty here in Bergen County, New Jersey. I hope you're all doing well and thanks so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. So if you're interested in real estate or any experiences here in Bergen County or Northern New Jersey, make sure to click that like button for me because every week I'm going to have new videos about anything and everything Bergen County as well as Northern New Jersey. All right, sit back, relax. I'm going to tell you my story about why did I buy a house in a flood zone? So this is kind of an interesting story because I didn't know my house was in a flood zone when we purchased it. So picture this, it's late 2005, I'm working in Manhattan, my husband's working in Manhattan, and we decide we are going to take the plunge, we're gonna move in together and we're gonna buy a house in New Jersey. We probably looked at maybe 20 houses or so, 15, 20 houses here in Bergen County. And then we stumbled upon our house here in Westwood, New Jersey. And honestly guys, it was one of those things when you first walk in, within 10 seconds, you just think, I really like this house. I think I might want to make an offer. And what do we like about it? It just had charm. It was a colonial. We love colonials. And I really fell in love with just the feel of the house. It was small, not too big. It had a great yard. It had a nice deck as well. Plus it was on a quiet street. So we really felt, you know what, this is kind of the house for us. I think we want to put in an offer. So in late 2005, we put in an offer on our house and it got accepted. So we were really excited about that. So then we're going through the whole mortgage process and we knew we needed a mortgage and going through that whole process, working with a mortgage broker. As we're accomplishing all the things that were necessary to get the mortgage, all of a sudden our mortgage lender says to us, hey, you guys might need flood insurance. And so thinking back, I remember when we looked at the listing, there was nothing, no indication that the listing had anything that this house would actually require flood insurance. So as we're talking to the lender, he said, yeah, it looks like maybe a part or a piece of the property might be in a floodplain. So that got a little bit stressful because you're like, all right, do I need flood insurance? Do I not? Why was it not disclosed? You know, all these questions started popping up. So he was looking at the FEMA maps, which are the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's a government agency. So basically what FEMA does is they look at flood maps. They are creating the maps that realtors need to be aware of, lenders need to be aware of as well, and these maps are constantly changing. So it turns out, as we were working with the lender said, you know, it looks like just a little piece of your property, the corner property, might be in a flood zone. And we also were aware that there was a stream nearby the house, so we thought, okay, so what happens? Like, does the stream just, if it floods, is it just gonna get to that one point in that one corner and it's not gonna touch the house? So we went through that whole process. It turns out we didn't need to get flood insurance. And by 2006, early 2006, we actually closed on our house. So totally excited, moved in, it was awesome. So we lived in our house here in Westwood for a few years. And then in 2010, we got notification from our lender that we needed flood insurance. So, you know, thinking back, I don't remember ever receiving something from FEMA, but we did get something from our lender because they must have been notified by FEMA. So lo and behold, because we had a mortgage, the mortgage company said, you need to get flood insurance. And this was in 2010. So that wasn't cool because once you start shopping flood insurance, it's kind of pricey. And then we went on to figure out that you couldn't really shop around flood insurance. FEMA kind of dictates what zone you're in. There's various zones, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But these zones dictate like how much coverage you potentially might need based on what they've determined. So kind of our hands were tied in 2010, and it was, you're gonna need this amount of flood insurance. It was over $3,000 was our policy. So all I can say now is that I am extremely happy that we had flood insurance because, you know, in New Jersey, the Northeast, we've been experiencing a lot of storms. There was Floyd, and there was Irene, and there was Sandy that hit us, you know, a few years ago. So lo and behold, in 2011, a storm called Irene hit the Northeast. And so when Irene hit, we actually, my husband and I, we were in Croatia on vacation with a couple of friends. So the kicker is we weren't even home. We were nowhere near our house. We were over in Croatia having a great time. So we had asked a few of our friends just to look over the house, and it turns out Irene was starting to hit and it was a lot of rain. Not only that, but the electricity in our house went out as well. And because we didn't have a generator, but we have a sump pump, and if you don't know what a sump pump is, and I'm gonna show you, it's basically a pump that's underground, it's in your basement floor. And what it does is it has this mechanism, so as water is rising, it will actually flush water out of your basement. So because it runs on electricity, since the power was out, we didn't have a generator. Our basement flooded and we had 1.5 feet of water. And thank goodness for good friends, because they really helped in that whole process. They were able to get a generator, they got our sump pump going, and they were able to remove the water. So we're drinking in Croatia. Do we go home? What do we do? I'm not sure what to do. Should we fly home? Meanwhile, this is your biggest possession, like the most expensive thing that you'll probably purchase in your lifetime. And you're like, oh my God, what about all of our stuff in the basement? You know, and all we could keep thinking about was just everything in our basement. We used it for a ton of storage. So we had our hot water heater, we had our washer and dryer, we had, you know, a bunch of comic books, for instance, and just, you know, holiday stuff. So was that all ruined? Like, what was the situation? So we just kept drinking in Croatia, trying to have a good time, and, you know, trusted that our friends were helping and taking care of everything, which they were awesome. So totally appreciated that. So we got home to about $10,000 worth of damage. Our heating system survived. Our hot water heater had to be replaced. Washer and dryer had to be replaced. Even our air conditioning system, like the chiller system that's in our basement, survived. The husband had a few boxes of comic books that got ruined. We had to throw out some furniture. We had a refrigerator downstairs that got ruined. All in all, it was about $10,000 worth of damage, and we were able to recoup all of that with our flood insurance policy. So through this whole process, a ton of learning happened with all of this. Even before I got into real estate, I learned a lot about flood insurance. One of the biggest things that I learned is that your homeowner's policy, you have a homeowner's policy on your house. That policy will not necessarily cover flood-related damage. So it's really important, if you are considering a house in a flood zone, that you speak to someone who is not only versed in homeowner's insurance, but also flood insurance as well. Two separate policies covering two different things. But the other big thing that I learned about was water tables. I had no idea what a water table was until we moved into this house and had to get flood insurance. Well, it turns out the reason that we need flood insurance is not because there's a stream nearby, but it's because of the water table. So if you're not familiar with a water table, it's the water that sits below ground level, that's in the earth basically. So in various parts of New Jersey, there are high water tables. So there is a lot of water that's underneath the ground, and what happens is water saturates the ground, water comes in, it actually raises the water level underneath the ground. And so for instance, in our situation, what happened was the water table, when we flooded in 2011, was rising and rising and rising, but our sump pump didn't burn out. We had no electricity to keep the sump pump going. That water was coming into our basement right at the sublevel, right below the floor, which is where the sump pump is. So because we had no electricity and we had no generator, the water just made its way up. So let me tell you, I mean, living in this flood zone, and during that time when Irene hit, being away from home was stressful. Coming home to damage was stressful. Filling out the insurance paperwork was stressful. And just having your belongings, some of your mementos, things that you've cherished and had for a long time, were completely ruined in that flood situation. And looking back, I mean, we kind of shake our heads like, oh, if we had known all of this, maybe we wouldn't have bought our house in a flood zone. You know, sometimes there are regrets that we did purchase here. If we knew what we know now, maybe we wouldn't have purchased this house, but we do love living here. We love the house. We love our neighborhood. But I mean, thinking back, we probably would have weighed those risks, right? Whatever those risks would have been, to decide, did it make sense for us? Is that something we wanted to pursue? But we did love the house. All right, so let's just jump into a little bit about flood insurance and just flood zones in general, just to give you a little bit of background, because maybe you are considering a house that's in a flood zone. And I think at the end of the day, what people want to consider is risk, right? Like, how much risk is there if I purchase this house that's in a flood zone? So like I said earlier in my story, you know, FEMA does designate flood zones. So if you're purchasing a house, you want to see where that address is contained, like what kind of a zone is that house in. And FEMA looks at a few factors. It will look at surrounding water. It will look at water, let's say if you're near a coastal area as well. Or it will also look at the water table. And then FEMA basically will look at risk, and it will identify if something is in a low risk area or a higher risk area. So if you're looking at houses, definitely look at the listings or work with your real estate agent to see what zone is the house actually in. So if you go to FEMA's website, FEMA.gov, you can actually look up an address of a house to see if it's in a flood zone or is it near a flood zone. So I have a little cheat sheet here, just the different risk areas of flood zones. When we first bought our house, we were in an X zone in 2006. And basically that's a very, very low risk opportunity for flooding to happen. But an X area can also be a shaded area. If you start to see shaded areas on the FEMA maps, that means there's a higher risk and you kind of make your way up. Sometimes it's a 500-year flood zone, sometimes it's a 100-year flood zone. And what that means is if it's a 100-year, within a 100-year time frame, there is or could be the possibility of flooding. The further up the curve you go is that you then get into the A zone, which are higher risk areas. So my house started as an X, which was a very, very low risk zone. All of a sudden went to an AE zone, which is like the worst. Like I remember thinking, how do you go from an X to an AE in the course of a few years? Well, because of the water table, it caused our zone to change to an AE, which really kind of stunk because we went from no flood insurance to over $3,000 a year of required flood insurance. So again, not cool. Also in the flood zone designations, you're gonna see the V zones. And the V zones are really meant for coastal areas. So a few other things in regards to flood zones and flood insurance. Some clients will ask me, well, how do I know if this house will eventually go into a flood zone? In all honesty, you don't. You really don't. But if you go to the FEMA.gov website and look up addresses, if you're near a flood zone, it could potentially change over time. But again, there's no guarantees. FEMA dictates that. So you definitely just want to see, could it be a potential risk area for the house that I'm considering purchasing? Also work very closely with your real estate agent just to see if there's any history whatsoever of flooding in that area, flooding at that property. You also can utilize your mortgage person. So if you are considering a house and it turns out to be in a flood zone, your mortgage person will most likely, I am almost 100% sure, depending on the situation, will probably require you to get flood insurance. But they have specific systems that they use to determine if a house is in a flood zone to see if it would require flood insurance. Again, the mortgage company is going to want to protect the investment, so they will require flood insurance if it's in a flood zone. Now here's the other thing. If you are paying cash and there's no mortgage, it then becomes your responsibility to purchase flood insurance if you even want to. It's really you have to identify your risk whether you want to get flood insurance or not. You can weigh the risk and not get flood insurance, but some of your belongings might not be covered if your property actually floods. Another question I get pretty frequently is just the value of homes that are in flood zones. I mean, honestly, just the mention of flood zone, people kind of cringe, right? You get, oh, flood zone, I'm not sure how I feel about that. But what if you do purchase and you decide to sell it at some point? So homes that are in flood zones, if they are being priced to sell, the agent who is listing the house should really consider what the actual real price should be, thinking about just what flood insurance might cost and the target that is on that property. Because when you hear flood zone, people think, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. So you have to somehow make it attractive to people, but it's gotta be priced well, number one. And it should really, number two, take into consideration the fact that it is in a flood zone. It's going to have that perception that's tied to it, so price it accordingly. But like anything, like any property, it's gotta be priced well. It has to match what's going on in the market, but you definitely wanna consider some sort of percentage reduction because of the flood perception. So could you make a profit if you go to sell? Absolutely you could, but you've just got to consider, when are you considering selling? If it's a hot market where there's not a lot of inventory and interest rates are low and people are buying like crazy, well, that could be a good opportunity to maybe take advantage of that market. All right, so there you go, a little story time about flood insurance and living in a flood zone. So if you take anything away from this video, again, just my advice to you is just weigh the risks. If you're considering a home that's in a flood zone, just think about that risk. Really do your due diligence. If you need a mortgage, work with your mortgage person to figure out what's needed. Work with your agent to get you connected to a great insurance company as well. Here's also something kind of interesting. You know, when we first needed flood insurance, there was no indication that you could actually shop your flood policy around. And what we noticed this year was we were actually able to get a major reduction due to some new FEMA policies, which was a really welcome change in regards to our flood policy. So I think our next house is really going to be in a high rise, right? just so we don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff in the future. So I want to thank you guys again for watching. Listen, if you have any questions whatsoever about real estate here in Bergen County or Northern New Jersey, my information is below. Go ahead, just reach out, send me an email, send me a text, or just give me a call. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Also, don't forget to click that like button for me and subscribe, because every week I'll have new videos about anything and everything Bergen County, New Jersey. So again, I'm Dzienis with eXp Realty. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next week with my next video.